Maybe you're on vacation and you're watching from the deck of your lake house or whatever you're doing. This is the time of year for us to hang out, talk, have some of those bigger picture conversations about football. But to do that, we need to make sure that people know the show is still going on when football is not at front of mind. So that's how you liking and subscribing will help us defeat my nemesis in life.
The almighty algorithm.
But of course, that leads us to what we have to talk about today, which is a Penn State roster update. Dante Cephas officially joining the Nittany Lions. Fitz wrote about that BlueWhiteIllustrated.com yesterday. And this is the major piece of the puzzle for the offseason. This is the major piece of the offensive side, especially from the transfer portal. So if you want to, just give us a quick recap of your conversation with him and some of the broad strokes of what you guys discussed.
You expect me to move right into football after that graphic there? Like, I'm not going to swear on the air, but where did that come from? Like,
have you is that the first time you've been?
That's the first time I've seen that. Yeah. I haven't,
okay.
As I said, I haven't been on that doesn't pop up in the recruiting show. We must already be in the algorithm. That one caught me off guard. Dante Cephas, speaking of caught me off guard, I actually had a conversation with him the other day. I haven't actually talked to him since he committed, did a little texting before he committed to Penn State back in January, but he's coming in. He's going to graduate on Thursday. He's going to move in this weekend, start classes on Monday. Not the only transfer to do so, but that's a big one for obvious reasons. This is the guy, when you take a look at Penn State's transfer class, this is the guy that's going to impact right away. He's what they believe to be a 1-2, a guy that can come in and start right away. You weren't sure where that would sort of land with Keandre Lambert-Smith, Trey Wallace, some of the other guys that they had in there, but they believe if he is what he's cooked up to be, and they think so. They've scouted him for a long time. This is a guy that they had their eyes on before he went in the portal just because of his production at Kent State. Phenomenal player, phenomenal athlete, and he's got a lot of things that can really help this offense, especially with a new quarterback. So I think he's a guy that you put your expectations. I know this has been a conversation on the board the last couple of days. Where do you compare him to Mitchell Tinsley coming in terms of expectations? I think a little bit ahead of that. Last year, I was very big on Parker Washington being the number one coming back. And Tinsley's production at Western Kentucky led people to believe that he would be the number one. But Parker Washington, I think he ended up proving it until he got hurt, was the number one guy for Penn State this year. This year, I'm not so sure. I mean, you have less coming back proven in Keandre Lambert-Smith, talented guy, amazingly talented athlete, was big at the end of the season, ended his season on a high note, absolutely. But Parker had a little bit more of a body of work coming back from 2021 and actually 2020 when he was a freshman. So I'm not sure where to slot him, but we'll just say 1-2 to be safe here. Trey Wallace had a great spring, of course, but Cephas has been productive. He has done it, albeit at a lower level, but he does have that production that Wallace does not have, and to a certain extent, Lambert-Smith doesn't have. So I'm excited to see what he can do. Not tremendously different in terms of body type, 6 foot, 185, can get down the field. He told me that's what he thinks he brings to the table. He thinks he can stretch the field, not only vertically, but horizontally as well in the short passing game. So I'm excited to see what he is because Penn State needs something. They need a shot in the arm. And Malik McClain was a guy that they were hopeful that could maybe help them out, maybe in the back end of the rotation. They brought Cephas in to be a frontline guy.
Yeah, for sure. I think that the addition of Cephas can actually help boost what McClain might be able to do in terms of now you kind of have a better idea of the defined roles after spring. Keandre Lambert-Smith, we saw him a good bit in the blue-white game in the slot. And Cephas, from what your discussion with him is about, I think that really leans into what his skills are and where Penn State needs a veteran presence. So if we're just taking what we saw from the blue-white game as a basic template, where there's going to be more intricacy for sure, but you've got Amari Evans and Trey Wallace on the outside. You need a guy with a little bit more proven production in that role. And to me, the interesting thing we do always talk about is like, who's the number one? And Jahan Dotson was a number one, but he could play all over the field. Parker Washington was the team's number one from the slot. And if you don't have that versatility to play outside, it does limit your ability to produce certain plays. And I know he made some big plays down the field. I'm not trying to mitigate what he did overall, but he's 85% plus of the time in the slot. Cephas can be that X receiver. He can be that number one guy that, as you mentioned, runs routes at all levels of the field and is a legitimate vertical threat. So is from an impact standpoint, Keandre Lambert-Smith can grab 3 catches for 112 yards and a touchdown, and he's an impact player. Dante Cephas, the offense could still run through him with that, and he could have 8 catches for 78 yards or 8 catches for 130. And it's just a different way of being the number one receiver. It gives you that balance and that option in the offense. And I think it's something Penn State desperately needed. Did you ever have a fear that the longer he stayed in the portal, something else could happen? Or was this pretty much locked in? Because that was always in the back of my mind. If you're technically in the portal, you're technically available.
Well, that's one thing he did tell me, is that other schools were still coming after him in the spring. It was pretty well locked in. I mean, Terry Smith has known him for a long time, predating his time at Kent State. Obviously, there's relationships there with Daquan Hardy, with Tank Smith, guys he was teammates with at Penn Hill. So this one was pretty well locked in. I think Penn State had to cover themselves, because if you're going to have to, I mean, his was a situation where he had to graduate from Kent State to be able to play, basically at Penn State. So there's far more intricate measures of that, but he had to graduate. So that's not always a guarantee. Like it's not a, I guess you couldn't treat it as a done deal if you're Penn State, just because of the possibility that maybe something happens with credits, something happens with grades, something like that. So had to keep their options open and continue to recruit. On the other side, like, you had to protect. He stayed in the portal so he could keep his contact up with Penn State. If he went back into the out of the portal, he would not have been able to do so. So that opens himself up to potentially somebody swooping in, throw a bag of cash at him, whatever, with NIL, and maybe something happens. He was open that other schools did still try to recruit him even after his commitment throughout the spring. But he said it wasn't really like something he was considering. He's had his eyes on Penn State for a long time. I know he visited UCLA, visited Pitt a couple of times, but he's had his eyes on Penn State for a long time. And that is something that, from talking to him, and going to do the full conversation at some point on BlueWhiteIllustrated.com. So check that out. But it's just really insightful into how the mind works for a guy that could have gone to the NFL. Like, he could have tested those waters right now. Had an ankle injury that factored into it, of course. Had a couple of things factored into it, but the really interesting story of how he sort of circled Penn State. Penn State circled him, and it worked out for both parties, or they hope it will work out for both parties once he gets here and once he gets going. That's the other thing, man, is like you're, I don't want to say gambling, but you hope he's that guy that you think he is. And sometimes that's not always the case. They thought Storm Duck would be a guy that could come in and start right away. He ended up being a 3-4. Now he's out of the program after a couple of months. So, like, transfer portal, that's you're playing with a hot stove there with the transfer portal. But we'll see what happens when he arrives. But I think the production's there, and that's the thing that I keep going back to with Alonzo Ford is he's at least produced. There's guys in the portal that are talented guys that we believe were talented guys when they were in high school, went to big programs and things like that, didn't quite produce. Alonzo Ford, we did not believe he was all that talented in high schools. We didn't really know about him. And then he ended up going and producing, albeit at a lower level. So these guys have production, and that's what you're kind of looking for when you're projecting these kids out for 1 year or multiple years, as in the case of Ford.